Liz Bishop is here now with her exclusive story of a childhood lost and a legal battle won.
Well, Stephen Mittler's 3-year legal odyssey began when he filed papers under the Child Victims Act and ended in late June when he received a check for $750,000 from the Albany Roman Catholic Diocese. Tonight, for the very first time, you will hear from this man who says the church moved a pedophile priest from church to church and in and out of treatment centers, repeatedly putting a skilled child abuser in the way of kids who he says, like himself, would become his victims.
That's where I met Mark the first time in August of 1988.
Right here.
Right in that church.
Steve Mittler was a 12-year-old boy attending church with his family in August of 1988 when he says the world as he knew it turned upside down with that introduction to then-father Mark Haight.
Immediately, he dug his teeth into our family. That afternoon, my brother, my father, and myself were up in the Cessna with him, and I feel that's exactly the first time he started to groom me.
Well, you used the word grooming. Explain what that meant.
Integrating with the family, becoming a friend of the family, working through my parents, really, to then find time with me.
Mittler says the priest was quick to earn the family's trust and would take 12-year-old Stephen to help him with projects at his cabin in the woods. That led to overnights where he says the sexual interaction would begin with a routine, working outside, dinner, and then...
And he always started with trying to wrestle. That was his MO. He didn't stop with wrestling.
The 47-year-old Mittler marvels at his ability to maintain a relatively normal, happy life through several years of alleged abuse. He said Haight never showed signs of concerns of being caught, in part he thinks because Bishop Howard Hubbard and the diocese merely shipped him from parish to parish when the priest's crimes were found out. Among the pages of pre-trial documentation that I received from Mittler, whose case was just weeks from trial when the diocese settled with him, were several formal complaints filed with the diocese and Bishop Howard Hubbard from alleged local victims of hate that date back to 1977 and even before that when he was a seminarian. According to Mittler's attorney, Jim Kelly, Haight was twice told to go away for treatment and declined, leaving the ministry at one point for 4 years and becoming a public school teacher. Kelly says Haight returned, agreed to get treatment, and was reinstated to ministry. Some of the complainants were altar boys who say the abuse happened at church facilities. One even claims he was abused while Haight, who was a pilot, was flying a plane. In another intake form, the recorder writes, quote, Haight did not deny the incident, end quote. In his deposition, the former priest denied some instances of abuse of minors and took the fifth over others. How much do you blame Howard Hubbard and the diocese for the pain you endured?
I blame them 100%. I should have never met Mark Haight.
It was when Mittler says another child being abused at the same time came forward that Haight was sent away. He says the abuse started again when Haight returned. Later, in Mittler's teens, the relationship sputtered to a stop. It wasn't until he sought counseling for the end of his marriage that he says he visited the trauma that the encounters had inflicted.
Just all of a sudden, all these emotions came forward with that process.
Fast forward to 2019. What went through your mind when you first heard of the Child Victims Act?
I was thrilled because it would give me my day in court.
Mittler says he may not have been the first to file, but on the first day of eligibility, he sent in his claim as John Doe. His identity would not remain a mystery through the entire process, however. On the day he sat in chambers discussing the resolution of the case, Mittler said revealing his name was more satisfying than the check itself.
I said, Your Honor, I would now like to be known as Stephen Mittler. And you could hear a pin drop. They knew that I was no longer going to hide behind my anonymity and become very vocal.
I asked him why he settled, accepting the $750,000. Did you not want your day in court, Steve?
I did, but I firmly believe that the diocese would have declared bankruptcy before July 25th.
Bankruptcy would have stopped the litigation in its tracks and tied up the case for years. Stephen Mittler says he has all his pretrial documentation that is public record that he will be revealing over time. He came forward now because he said he wanted us all to have a face and a childhood destroyed to focus on when thinking of victims of priest sex abuse.
I'm just at the beginning of telling my story.
Steve Mittler says for him, justice came when he received a $2,000 settlement check in his name from Mark Haight. He compares the diocese practice of shifting priests accused of sexual abuse from parish to parish to putting a bottle of vodka in front of a recovering alcoholic, leaving them alone for the weekend and wondering when you come back, will the bottle be full or empty? I reached out to the diocese and their attorney, Michael Costello, for comment and was sent this statement attributed to Bishop Edward Scharfenberger. I want to help all survivors find healing of body, heart, and soul. That includes arranging for financial redress for that specific group of survivors whose abuse happens to fall within the CVA parameters. My proposal for these survivors provides a shorter and less traumatic process and as large a sum as possible for those survivors to share, whereas all other legal options they have will siphon off substantial sums for court and legal fees. We intend to walk with the survivors as they move forward through the healing process. Mittler calls the bishop's path forward settlement plan based on court mediation a PR stunt and adds if the diocese really wants to be fair and equitable, it would come up with a pot of $300 million and pay each of the 400+ other victims the same $750,000 he received. He believes the diocese will file for bankruptcy anyway before the next trial is set to begin in September. His attorney says the diocese might have to prove that it had limited assets, less than the amount of the claims, if it did so.
Liz Bishop is here with a major new development following her exclusive interview with the first man to settle his lawsuit with the diocese. Liz.
Well, 3 weeks ago, Stephen Mittler received a check for $750,000 from the Albany Roman Catholic Diocese. He had claimed in his lawsuit that was settled out of court that the church knowingly allowed a pedophile priest to ensnare young victims, including himself, into a web of sexual abuse. He told his story to me exclusively earlier this month, promising that the settlement was not the end for him, but just the beginning. And now comes round two, an invitation extended and accepted by Bishop Edward Scharfenberger for a face-to-face meeting at the very church where Mittler says the abuse started. Steve, what is your end game here?
Yeah, it's just something that I feel is necessary. And Bishop Scharfenberger has offered to walk with survivors, and this truly puts him in a position where he can do that. You know, we'll be standing in the exact footprints of where I met my abuser, Mark Haight, in August of 1988.
On Sunday, nearly 34 years to the day after he met the man he says sexually abused him for more than 5 years, Stephen Mittler will stand in front of the Corpus Christi Church in Round Lake once again and look for words of healing from Bishop Edward Scharfenberger, a man he has never met, but who signed off on a check for $750,000 as settlement of Mittler's Child Victims Act lawsuit before it went to trial. What do you expect to come out of this?
I hope that he'll have a resolution that he can bring back to the diocesan attorneys that says, you know, what are we doing? Are we doing everything we can for these other 400 victims and these other 400 plaintiffs?
Mittler is especially concerned with the bishop's comments since the settlement that the diocese would be looking at ways to enhance training for priests and enhance background checks of those considering the ministry.
The fact that they feel there's room for improvement is pretty shocking.
He went into the lawsuit as a John Doe and came out Stephen Mittler, determined to tear down the walls of secrecy behind clergy sex abuse and to offer solace and hope to other victims, some of whom he says are now reaching out to him. What are you going to say to Bishop Scharfenberger that will make a difference?
I'd like to develop a working relationship. I don't need a relationship with the church or with whomever the Catholic Church would like me to believe in, but if we can create a working relationship to work through some of these items, I think that would be certainly welcome on my side.
He says he has no idea what will happen at that church on Sunday.
It's been overwhelming. Folks that aren't even religious that have left the church that said, you know, I will be there, I'll be by your side.
Mittler says he kept his terrible secret from everyone for the better part of 30 years and that he will no longer be silent. He's hoping that this meeting with the bishop leads to an ongoing dialogue, not just for himself, he says, but for all those who have been victimized by sexual predators. He's inviting anyone who wishes to support his quest for answers to join him Sunday at Corpus Christi Church in Round Lake. I'm told there will be a private meeting between the two at 10:30 and then a public statement outside the church.
Our top story, all new tonight. A Clifton Park man awarded $750,000 in a settlement of his Child Victims Act lawsuit got his wish today when he met with the head of the Albany Catholic Diocese. After receiving a check last month, he wanted more, a conversation about clergy sex abuse. Liz Bishop reports.
Stephen Mittler had not been to Sunday Mass in close to 30 years, but this Sunday he made an exception for this meeting with Albany Bishop Edward Scharfenberger.
I'm the face of an abused. My abuser is Mark Haight, who is a face of clergy sex abuse. Bishop Scharfenberger represents the organization that allowed this to happen.
Mittler had not come to worship at Corpus Christi Church in Round Lake, but to be heard and to listen, and he did not come alone. His 2 children and dozens of friends, family, and strangers, all wearing blue as a sign of peace and solidarity, offered support.
Steve's come out full force, not hiding who he is. Showing a lot of courage to do that.
Mittler says Father Mark Haight groomed him at Corpus Christi and then sexually abused him for years.
I should have never met Mark Haight. Mark Haight should have been arrested and in prison right now.
As head of the diocese and while facing hundreds of similar Child Victims Act lawsuits, Scharfenberger promised to walk in the footsteps of the hundreds of CVA plaintiffs as a way of healing. Mittler took him literally, inviting the bishop to begin a dialogue on the very spot where he says he met his alleged abuser. And the bishop agreed, although he would not comment on Sunday, saying the day belonged to Mittler, who called the meeting productive.
To talk about this, to see what we can do to help other victims, right? So for me, it's an awareness campaign and a transparency campaign. So from an awareness perspective, I've had dozens of people reach out to me that said, me too. And the bishop and I talked about the fact that we need to tie together some of the events that took place in the 80s and 90s and finish telling the story.
Mittler listened intently but did not participate during the service itself as the bishop spoke to the congregation about the clergy abuse scandal.
Stephen is a face of this, but he's not the only one. Now, I admire his courage, but I recognize that there are many survivors who suffer in silence.
Scharfenberger went on to encourage all those who had been abused by clergy to reach out to him directly.
I want no one to suffer in silence. And take an example from Stephen. That may be your way to do this. You can always call me.
The Mass included prayers for all victims of sexual abuse.
Being able to talk about sexual abuse on the pulpit takes a lot. It's a shocking topic for a congregation to hear, and I appreciate that he identified me personally and personalized the Mass that way.
I spoke to Bishop Scharfenberger outside church as he greeted parishioners and asked him if he would have a comment on the events of this day. And he said no, that this was a day for Stephen Mittler, but he assured me that he would sit down and talk to me about this case and the hundreds of Child Victims Act lawsuits that the church is facing. Mittler told me the 2 will meet again in August. Liz Bishop reporting from Round Lake for CBS 6 News.
More than 400 Child Victims Act cases have been lodged against the Albany Roman Catholic Diocese, claiming clergy were allowed to prey on children with impunity for decades, while church officials turned a blind eye. Tonight, Liz Bishop has an exclusive conversation with the church leader who finds himself at the eye of the storm, Bishop Edward Scharfenberger.
Well, he says he wants to, quote, walk with the survivors, but the path ahead for Bishop Scharfenberger is littered with challenges. He must heal the pain of sex abuse while juggling the need for accountability and do it with what he says are limited resources. And the pressure is on with an onslaught of legal action just around the corner. This week, I sat down for an exclusive interview with the head of the diocese, a man who was not even in Albany when these abuses allegedly took place, but who must now solve this enormous problem.
All I ask of you is that you bring the best out of me, and I'll bring the best out of you.
8 years ago, Edward Scharfenberger, Bishop of Albany, took over the role of spiritual leader to more than 300,000 local Catholics from Howard Hubbard, a man who has gone on the record admitting that he covered up clergy sex abuse in order to avoid scandal and maintain respect for the priesthood. Can you understand that mindset?
No, I can't. Let me be blunt. You've got a rotten apple in the barrel who can cause the other apples to become rotten. I don't see how you preserve the purity and goodness of the rest of the apples by hiding the rotten apple.
But because he has admitted that he did allow that to happen, does that make him a rotten apple?
That's not my judgment to make. Only God can judge what's in his soul.
In some ways, Scharfenberger is now the one being judged. Some would say he's fighting for the very soul of his church.
To answer your question, Liz, do I think that not revealing, not reporting to civil authorities, not revealing the bad behavior,
or allowing it to persist?
Certainly allowing it to persist. Again, what do you do to prevent that behavior from, you certainly don't reassign them. But unfortunately, that was practice, and if Bishop Hubbard admits to that, under oath, it's not the first time I heard that. And it's not the first time I heard it from a bishop.
And the only thing I would say about that would be that the Catholic Church somehow might have been held to a higher standard than allowing that to happen.
Yes, absolutely. We're accountable to God. We're accountable to the truth. But people sometimes do things in a pragmatic way rather than in a principled way.
Scharfenberger, who is himself a lawyer, tells me it would not be wise to discuss his conversations with Hubbard about his actions because of pending litigation. On Sunday, the bishop met with the first person to settle with the diocese on the very spot at Corpus Christi Church that Stephen Mittler says he met Father Mark Haight. He claims Haight sexually abused him for years. Mittler has said repeatedly that the church's cover-up of Haight's long string of abuses set him up to become a victim.
I should have never met Mark Haight. Mark Haight should have been arrested and in prison right now.
The bishop says the Mittler settlement was pared down from an original ask of $2 million to $750,000. He called it a mutual agreement calculated on a, quote, distasteful system based on the degree of abuse.
This is the way the system works. It's settled in money.
But Mittler says it was the threat of bankruptcy, which would have tied his case up without resolution for years, that motivated him to settle. Anyone who's ever been to the Vatican may feel a disconnect at equating the Catholic Church with all its riches and priceless art with bankruptcy.
It's not as easy to get money into a pot as might at first seem. We're not like a multinational corporation. We have no pipeline to the Vatican.
Scharfenberger said not only is there no path to the Vatican vault, the pockets of the Albany Diocese are not deep.
God forbid we went into bankruptcy, that would become very clear. And it might be a shock to many people. The church in the Diocese of Albany is not rich.
So who's going to pay?
A parish would not have to pay for something the diocese is being sued for. There's no obligation. And
would they be asked to?
It might be. It's possible to ask. It depends upon who would do the asking.
Would you?
Potentially, I might say. If we're trying to create a fund, I might ask, sure.
Mittler has also accused the diocese of stonewalling as he went through the legal process, refusing to produce documents that would have added clarity to his case, like sealed personnel records and psychological treatment evaluations.
I've heard a lot of talk about secret files. There are no secret files. Our files are confidential in the way that files, that ordinary personnel files would be confidential in a business.
But there is this sense that you're not being transparent by them not being revealed.
Well, it's not as simple as it's that let's get all of the records out there. Does everybody really want to know everything, every sin that every person committed?
Possibly.
Yeah, that's going to help.
I'm just saying possibly they want to know.
Anybody for whom it is an important thing to know that, I have no problem with them knowing it. We routinely would share that information.
But there are people saying that the church tried to keep its secrets at the expense of doing the right thing.
No question that happened. But that's not what's happening now. That's not what we do.
The bishop later clarified by email that there is no right to secrecy in criminal matters and that anything that is criminal needs to be disclosed. How does an organization that's founded on love and kindness find itself in this position?
Sin. Human beings are subject to be tempted, to be corrupted, to be led the wrong way, and to look for love in the wrong places, quite frankly.
Do you think that there is a possibility that the church could not survive?
Nobody ever said the church has to be rich. The church has to have buildings. the church has to have stuff. That's the way of the world. So even if all that goes, the church will survive.
The bishop added that sometimes it's not a bad idea to shake things up and start from scratch again. As for reaching some kind of accommodation with the survivors, Bishop Scharfenberger told me that there is, quote, a sincere effort on both sides to do mediation, but he does not think the plan currently being worked on will be in place before the September trial date. He says a few settlements could exhaust the limited amount of assets and force the diocese to file for bankruptcy. I asked him if he was surprised at the depth of the problem in the diocese, and he said no, the problem of sex abuse is much broader in our society than anyone knows or wants to admit.